Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah alladhi hadana li hadha wa ma kunna linahtadiya lawla an hadana Allah. Allahumma laka alhamdu kama yanbaghi li jalali wajhik wa 'azimi sultanik. Subhanak Allahumma la nuhsi thana'an 'alayka anta kama athnayta 'ala nafsik. All praises to Allah, all praises to Allah, all praises to Allah who guided us to this. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had not guided us, then we would not have been guided. It was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who guided us to this blessed religion to be practiced in this blessed country, at this blessed institution, in this blessed city, on this blessed day, at this blessed hour, in this blessed gathering. O Allah, to you is praise as is commensurate to the majesty of your countenance and the supremeness of your authority. O Allah, we do not limit you with any praise that we come up with ourselves. Rather, we admit that it is only you who knows the true extent of your praiseworthiness. We begin by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because it is by His blessing and His mercy that we are here in this gathering, that we came on this day to come together and gain some spiritual benefit. We could have been anywhere else in the world or on this campus, but we chose to come here at this time for some benefit, and inshallah we all are rewarded for that. What we find in many of our experiences as religious people or people who try to seek to be religious is that many of us often will make good intentions about things, and we'll make these intentions about drawing near to God in some way to get some benefit, some spiritual benefit in our day-to-day lives. But it can be very easy for us to get discouraged from various factors, and because of maybe some issues that we have in ourselves. Maybe we don't have as much patience, or we don't have as much piety, for example, as we might like to. It's easy for us to get discouraged by little setbacks that we have in our lives. And this very commonly comes from the fact that, we seek to be like a good Muslim, for example, whatever that may mean to us. We seek to be a good Muslim, but for whatever reason, we don't feel like we are Muslim enough. We don't feel like we really fit into the archetypal Muslim or the identity of a Muslim that's set up for us to be part of. This comes from a variety of different sources or ideas. A very common one, for example, is, well, I don't pray. I don't even pray on a daily basis. So how could I ever be a real Muslim? And I get discouraged by the fact that I can't become this real Muslim, whatever that may mean to us. Or it's like, oh well, I don't even wear hijab. Like I don't even look like the archetypal Muslim woman. How could I ever be a real Muslim woman, whatever that may mean? And also we may compare ourselves to other people, and we're like, oh, well, I'm not nearly as pious or as righteous as this other person. How could I ever be a real Muslim? And unfortunately, there are two sides to this. On the one hand, many of us may experience these feelings of alienation and stuff like that, and that's an issue. But also, in many cases, we may be complicit in the system that causes other people to feel that way. We may be complicit in being one of those people that sets up this this unattainable archetype of what a Muslim is or what a Muslim should be. So those are both separate issues, and I'll try to touch on both of them in today's khutbah, inshallah. And so the underlying point of everything that I just said is that what we find is that we make the road to our spiritual benefit, we make our road to getting closer to God more difficult because either we, ourselves, or someone else sets up this unattainable archetype of what a Muslim should be based on their own subjective experiences, or as communities we create these archetypal Muslims that are perhaps not in line with what our Islamic tradition informs us. And because our reality does not match up with what that archetype is, that gives us feelings of alienation, and gives us feelings of dissatisfaction with our own spiritual experiences. So this leads us to kind of the overarching theme of this brief talk, which is, it comes from, there's a certain organization called Ta'leef Collective, and kind of its theme or its motto is, come as you are to Islam as it is. Come as you are to Islam as it is. And what we find is that in this statement there are obviously two parts. There's come as you are, and there is to Islam as it is. And what we find is that for the majority of us, and I would say probably the vast majority of Muslims in America or Muslims elsewhere, not just in America, the emphasis is on the second part of this statement, which is just, come to Islam. And there isn't really any aspect of individualization there. It's just, you do this and be a Muslim. And, the foundation of that in many cases is that Islam is a set of rules and you have to follow these rules, and if you follow these rules, you're now a Muslim. Which, if we study the Islamic tradition, we know that this is not true. We know that this is not how Islam works. Islam, yes, there are many rules in Islam. We don't shy away from this fact. There are many rules in Islam that can kind of bog people down. But ultimately, the purpose of our existence is not to follow rules. It's not to follow the rules of Islam. We don't exist to worship Islam. We don't worship our religion. We worship God. And we believe that Islam is a conduit to God, and we believe that it is the truthful, the correct conduit to God, right? And this idea of rules being the guiding framework to everyone's life is problematic for a variety of reasons. One is the one that I just mentioned, that Islam is not just about following rules. It's first and foremost about your relationship with God, to know and to love God, first and foremost. The second issue that comes up with having this framework of rules as being the framework for everyone's existence is that we find that the people who kind of parrot this idea that Islam is a set of rules, and to be a Muslim you just have to follow these rules, and that's what makes you a Muslim. In many cases, the people who kind of parrot this idea, they are actually not even people of knowledge. They are not actually amongst the scholars in the Islamic tradition. So that's another issue, because we have laypersons creating this puritanical sort of culture within our communities, and this drives people away, right? And this is very much against the idea of come as you are to Islam as it is. So that's kind of the first issue that we see here, is that we focus on this. You need to come to Islam and do this and do that, and that's the end of it. So the first issue that I'm trying to identify here is that Islam is not necessarily about rules. There are rules in Islam, but Islam is first and foremost about your relationship to God. And built into that understanding is the first part of the statement, right? So if we accept that Islam is about your relationship to God, implicit in that statement is that it is a personalized relationship with God. Not everyone's relationship with God is the same. And this also goes back to a previous point that I made about us comparing ourselves to other people. If I see Barry, and I'm like, Barry has this great relationship with God, and I don't have that. So, on the one hand, yes, you should seek to have this positive and this enriching experience with God, but you don't know what Barry's experience is actually like. And we know that ultimately our experiences are very personalized, and they're internal, and we don't really know what goes on in other people's hearts. We only know what goes on in our own hearts. So that's something also to keep in mind, is that your experience with Islam and your experience with God is very much a personal one. It is a personal spiritual journey. And it's not necessarily about what you think the Muslim community, whatever that may mean to you, is going through. And one of the stories that I like to use to illustrate kind of this point of there being an individualized understanding of Islam, it comes from the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and it's not a really commonly told story, and it's also a bit of a strange story, but I think it illustrates this point well. So there was a man, or I believe it was a youth, I don't know the age of the person, but the story goes that a man came to the Prophet ﷺ, and he was basically talking about how, and I'm going to paraphrase the story, I don't remember the exact story, but basically he came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, I was fasting in Ramadan, and I basically had sexual relations with my wife during the day. And if we are familiar with the jurisprudence of Ramadan and fasting in Ramadan, it's not permissible to have marital relations during the day, even between a married man and woman. So the Prophet ﷺ says, okay, this is kind of the expiation for, actually before I even proceed from that, take a moment to appreciate the fact that someone came in a gathering and said this to the Prophet ﷺ. Now imagine for a second, juxtapose that idea on whatever community that you may come from, and imagine someone came to like your imam, or like the average imam, and said, I had sex with my wife while I was fasting. Like, can you imagine the kind of rebuke that person would probably receive in the average community? Can you imagine like how much like shame would be cast upon that person? So first, appreciate the fact that there is a system in place in the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ where people felt that they could go to the Prophet ﷺ and talk to him about their very personal problems, and talk to him very frankly and openly about these issues. And I would say that for the most part, this is lost on many of our communities. And this is probably why there are many people who leave their masajid and they don't really come back to them, because they don't feel like there's a place for them to be able to talk about the issues that they struggle with as Muslims and as people. So anyways, this person comes to the Prophet ﷺ and he says, you know, I did this, and you know, what should I do? And the Prophet ﷺ says, you know, this is the expiation for breaking your fast deliberately. Basically, you know, you have to fast continuously for, I believe it's 60 days, okay? And the man says to the Prophet ﷺ, he says, I couldn't fast for one day. How do you expect me to fast continuously for 60 days? Now again, imagine that this was done in like your average community, like, or you know, just like some religious figure. You were telling the story to a religious figure, they would probably rebuke you. They would tell you to stop being, you know, such a terrible person, stop, you know, have some restraint over yourself, etc. Prophet ﷺ did not have this response. He said, okay, if you can't do this expiation, this is how you basically pay. You can give a donation to the poor in this amount to expiate for your broken fast. And the man says to the Prophet ﷺ, he says, I'm a poor man. I don't have money to donate to anyone. The Prophet ﷺ says, okay. And he calls one of his companions and he tells him to bring over basically a whole bunch of dates. And the companion brings over this amount of dates, and he gives it to the man, and he says, go give this to your family. Your family is poor. Give this to your family, and you will be forgiven of your issue. This will be expiated. Now, look at the way that this issue was handled. It was very personalized. It took account of what this person's situation was, took account of what this person's shortcomings were, and a solution was brought forth by the authority of the land, by the Prophet ﷺ himself. And I would say that for the most part, we don't really have that. We don't really have this individualized experience. We don't really account for people's experiences and the shortcomings that they may have. So I say all of that to say that this is something that we need to seek to foster in our own community, and we need to foster it in our communities wherever we come from. So now I want to go back to the first part of the statement, which is come as you are, and we've already kind of touched upon this. So the statement that we're using as the overriding framework here is come as you are to Islam as it is. We recognize that in this idea of coming as you are is this idea that we will have our own experiences and our own shortcomings that we will come from. You know, and we'll bring these experiences to the table. And we recognize that we will have our own doubts, our own internal contradictions, our own issues that exist within our life. And we need to accept the fact that everyone has these issues. It should not come as a shock to anyone that people within our community, wherever we may be, have doubts about the existence of God, or they have doubts about the justness of God and certain ideas that are presented in Islam. It's okay for these doubts to exist. What's not okay is for us to cast away people for having these doubts, to cast away people for being different, to cast away people for having these issues. And that is probably one of the main reasons why people leave Islam, or they may still identify as a Muslim, but they're not really part of any kind of community where they come from. Like a woman, let's say a woman goes to her husband and she says, I'm not her husband, or she goes to her imam in her community, because the imam is supposed to be upholding some kind of spiritual help in the community. She says to the Imam, my husband is abusing me. I'm suffering from domestic abuse. And the Imam might say, sister, just be patient. No, that's the wrong answer. That's not the answer to that statement. It's not to be patient. You know, in an actual, real prophetic tradition following community, that's not what the answer would be. The answer would be, okay, tell me about your situation. Let's see what we can do to get you out of this situation. Let's see what we can do to remedy this situation. And, you know, Adnan talks a lot about this idea of spiritual bypassing, which, you know, to give a short definition of it is basically to use these general principles from the Islamic tradition to essentially erase or silence or overlook people's problems. You know, in this case, this person was suffering from domestic abuse, and this Imam might say, oh, you know, just be patient. That's called spiritual bypassing. You're using this very general, very non-specific term from the Islamic tradition, and you're applying it to someone's very specific problem, and you're erasing whatever issue that person may be experiencing. So spiritual bypassing is a symptom of not meeting people where they are. It's a symptom of not meeting people where they are and trying to assess their situation and help them get acclimated to the community that they are in. And, you know, built into all of these ideas is the fact that we need to have a place for anyone who is interested in learning about Islam or growing closer to God and finding some sort of spiritual sustenance. We need to have a place for these people in every single one of our communities. Nobody has a monopoly on being a Muslim. Nobody has a monopoly on what the Islamic tradition is. Contrary to what many of us are taught or what we feel growing up, there isn't someone who gets to decide whether or not you are a Muslim. So long as you accept, you know, the very basic principle of, you know, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad ﷺ is his final messenger, you are a Muslim. And nobody gets to tell you, oh, you know, brother, you don't pray, you're not a Muslim. Nobody gets to tell you that. They don't have a monopoly on making that declaration for you. Or, you know, sister, I don't like the way that you dress. You're not a Muslim. Nobody gets to tell you that. Nobody has a monopoly over these kinds of statements. And it's very important for us to be aware within our communities of people kind of spouting this kind of dialogue, of not meeting people where they are and guiding them to what could be a very beneficial spiritual experience for them. And with all of that, we recognize that there are aspects of the Islamic tradition which are non-negotiable. For example, in the issue of prayer, we recognize that praying 5 times a day is something that, as Muslims, we believe to be a requirement upon Muslims. But what we don't believe is that we can go to someone who is not praying or struggling with their prayer and say, you're not a Muslim anymore. You don't pray. I don't think you're a Muslim. You need to fix yourself. That's not how these systems work. But what we can kind of synthesize as a beneficial middle ground is that when we say come to Islam, come as you are to Islam as it is, what we're saying is come as you are and bring your flaws with you and allow Islam to be some sort of transformative experience for you in your life. Allow Islam to benefit you, to give you spiritual sustenance in some meaningful way. So we recognize that Islam has the power to transform people. Islam has the power to change people's outlooks on life, to bring happiness into people's life where they may not have found it otherwise, to give them fulfillment in their life where they may not have found it otherwise. And that we should invite people to come to Islam just as they are, with whatever issues that they have, whatever flaws that they have, whether they may be character flaws, or maybe we don't like the way they look, or something like that. Whatever it may be, it is still our responsibility to welcome those people into our communities and to allow them to have a positive spiritual experience and for them to kind of, in some way, pave their own path. You know, to be there for them, but to also recognize that they have their own ways of drawing closer to God. And this is another really important thing for us. We all have different ways that we draw nearer to God. You know, some people might really appreciate nature, for example. And if nature is what causes you to feel closer to God and to feel, wow, look at this beautiful creation, then pursue that. Pursue the things that draw you closer to God. And don't worry if the way that you experience that is different from the way that someone else is doing so. Because, again, it is about your spiritual experience. It is about your relationship with God. So the synthesis that we come to in the end is for us to be fostering communities and to be fostering cultures within our communities of inviting people as they are, whatever it may be, however you can connect with someone to Islam such that they may experience a kind of benefit. And that we also do the same for ourselves, because we all have our own individual issues spiritually. We have our own doubts, we have our own shortcomings, and we need to accept the fact that regardless of how we are, regardless of what issues we may have inside of us, Islam is still for us. Islam will still welcome us. And we can come as we are to Islam as it is. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to be a community that establishes these ideas within our communities. Say Ameen.